Having the opportunity to return to the Persona 5 universe and spend more time with its characters has been one of my biggest gaming desires in recent years. Last year, we got Persona 5 Royal, which offered a fantastic opportunity to revisit the story along with some new twists and turns and a good chunk of new story content. And yeah, I loved every minute of it. But, admittingly, a majority of the good sensations were linked to nostalgia, given that roughly the first 85% of the game was a repeat of the base game. I really longed for a new journey with the characters who I've come to adore, and I was pleasantly surprised when it was revealed that Persona 5 Strikers would be coming to the West. It promised a brand new journey with the Phantom Thieves, along with a new adventure, new characters, new dungeons, and a new gameplay style not found in the base experience. And so, I'm getting way ahead of myself, but I might as well just be honest and acknowledge the title of this video and expose my bias. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. I knew I was gonna love this game going into it, and I absolutely did. It reminds me so much of the feeling I got when I played the Blood and Wine expansion for The Witcher 3, which is another one of my top 5 favorite games of all time. It, just like Strikers, was a significant and meaty second helping of a dish I had thoroughly enjoyed. It took me roughly 35 hours to complete Persona 5 Strikers on my PS5, and you best believe I took my time with it in order to savor every morsel of its main story. With that being said, the game does have some issues, and since this is a review, it's only natural that I bring them up. I'm gonna be as objective as I can, but I loved my time with this game. For the most part. So with that, welcome to my review of Persona 5 Strikers. So for me, it's only natural to start by talking about the story of Persona 5 Strikers, and that's because it was the element I was most looking forward to returning to, and it's the one that dominates much of the game's runtime. Now, I'm not here to tell you that the plotline of Persona 5 was its strongest element, because it's not. Anyone who has come to enjoy these games will tell you that the overall plot, while enough to keep your attention, is not really the main draw of the series. Instead, the characters you meet along the way are what sell you on the experience. Morgana, Ryuji, An, Yusuke, Makoto, Futaba, and Haru each have distinct personalities, but they jive together so well, and each endear the player to them as individuals, as well as the dynamic that they create as a group. It's why the idea of Strikers was so appealing. It was a chance to meet back up with these characters and see how life had changed, no pun intended, as if they were friends that we hadn't seen for a while. After playing through Persona 5 and spending roughly 100 hours with them, you grow a sense of connection to these characters and the stories you shared together. The base game's biggest success was creating a sense of camaraderie between the player and the characters, despite the obvious barrier of our reality versus the artificial reality presented in video games. This is why the original game was beloved by so many, myself included, and it's why getting to come back to this world was so appealing. And what makes Strikers work is the fact that the developers knew how critical this component of the original game was and how vital it was to carry that over into this new experience. And I'm happy to report that they accomplished this goal in spades. The game boldly assumes you've played Persona 5, so if you haven't, this game really isn't for you. Sure, you can still get by and enjoy the story here, but you won't appreciate it at the same level as those who have played P5. Beware of that if you're a newcomer. Anyway, the first hour of this game contains a massive amount of fan service that continues to be sprinkled in even as the game progresses into its later hours. There's plenty of callbacks to the previous game, like Morgana insisting he's not a cat, Haru's alter ego as Beauty Thief, and Makoto's iconic Fist of Justice line. The game takes time to pick fun at these lines, and it always left a smile on my face. But it's not all callbacks, as there's humorous new encounters for the gang to navigate, like Ryuji accidentally ordering a solid gold bar worth a ton of money, or picking a date to ride the Ferris wheel with, spending all day at the beach, and helping the guys get themselves out of an awkward sauna encounter with the ladies. Despite these all being relatively small moments, especially within the grand scheme of the plot, they stuck out to me simply because how strong the characters are and the great amount of respect that I have for them. They did a great job of slowly building and changing these characters without them losing sight of what made them unique throughout Persona 5, and that effort is continued here in Strikers. And this isn't hyperbole. I firmly believe that you could remove the gameplay sections from Strikers and still be able to find ways to enjoy this title simply on the backs of the characters alone. With that being said, we do have a plot-driven story and a new combat system to talk about, so let's move in that direction now that this fanboy praise section is over. The story here is a continuation of Persona 5. Not Persona 5 Royal, meaning the events involving Maruki and Kasumi are not canon to this rendition of the world. Strikers also forgoes the confidant system of P5 and instead relies on an overarching narrative to guide its events while also sprinkling in a healthy dose of cheerful moments that embody the spirit of teenage getaways. I'll summarize the overall plot in a few moments, but it's important to recognize going into this that the somber and sometimes malicious encounters found in the main plot are often softened by moments where the teens simply get to enjoy themselves and each other's company. I've already mentioned the beach day and the accompanying barbecue, but there's also a plentiful number of feasts and visits to other attractions. It creates a wonderful dichotomy so that the story never feels too sorrowful, while also not being a solely joyous tour of the Japanese cityscapes. These moments of pure friendship are used liberally throughout the game, and it goes a long way in easing the wound that's sure to come with the loss of the confidant system and the base game's other life sim mechanics. The events of Strikers kick off with Ren, aka Joker, returning to Shibuya to spend the summer vacation with all of his friends. The game's first hour is about giving the player some time to reunite with the characters they love, which was a smart choice. Meeting back up with the gang and seeing Sojiro just feels right, and allowing us time to soak it all in was very appreciated. The gang celebrates the reunion while catching up and discussing a new phone app that they've all been using called Emma. We also meet a few new characters, most important of which is Senkichi Hasagawa, a police detective who's working a series of linked cases all centered around so-called change of heart incidents. All over Japan, reports have come in of people being brainwashed, and naturally, the police want to get to the bottom of it. Returning back to Ren and the gang, we spend the next day exploring Shibuya until something strange happens. Ryuji and Ren meet up with a woman named Alice Haragi, who is a fashion icon. After adding her on Emma, Ren, Ryuji, and Morgana are pulled into the metaverse for the first time since defeating Yaldabaoth, the god of control, at the end of Persona 5. At first, the trio believes that they've stumbled into a palace, but they soon realize that the scale is far too big to apply that label. They eventually encounter a shadow version of Alice and are quickly dumped into a landfill where they meet up with the other main character addition, Sophia. She's a computer AI, programmed to be humanity's companion, and despite her strange mannerisms, she quickly proves herself to be efficient in combat, and the Phantom Thieves elect to take her with them on their search for an exit. The three meet back up with the rest of the Phantom Thieves, and Sophia tags along by hanging out in Ren's phone. They discuss what happened and resolve to change Alice's heart after investigating her further. As the gang moves throughout Alice's metaverse, they utilize new terminology like jails, desires, cages, and more to contextualize what they are seeing. A lot of these new terms can be paralleled with ones we used in the previous game, and Strikers does a great job of committing to these terms so that the player is able to understand them contextually within the story. Essentially, a jail is a souped-up version of a palace where desires are stolen from the masses in order to fuel the desire of the monarch. In order to reach the monarch, in this case Alice's shadow, the gang must find 3 cages and steal mementos from them that represents the ruler's most prized possessions. Before the boss showdown can begin, the gang must confront the monarch's past trauma and deal with a warden who represents a moment of intense pain in the person's life. And then finally, the gang confronts the monarch in a final showdown to change their heart and rescue the desires stolen from the common folk, which ends their brainwashed state in the real world. And so a majority of the dungeons in the game will follow this setup. Infiltrate, find the 3 cages, learn about the trauma and defeat the warden, and then beat the final boss, before moving on. The Phantom Thieves are able to defeat Alice and change her heart, but are soon tracked down by Inspector Hasegawa, who I will be referring to as Zenkichi for the rest of this video. He has deduced your role as the Phantom Thieves and makes you an offer. Help him find the true mastermind in the recent change of heart cases, and he will help in clearing your names as the primary suspects. After mulling it over, the gang eventually agrees to the deal and packs their bags for an extensive trip across Japan to find more jails and travel for their summer vacation. Over the next few weeks, the Phantom Thieves locate 2 more jails and change the hearts of a writer named Natsume and a mayor named Hyoto. And as they do so, they learn more about the Emma app that seems to link everything together. They even stumble upon its creator, a woman named Ichinose, as well as its current owner, the Medice Company, led by its CEO, Akira Konoe. They also begin to realize that the jails are most likely being created by someone else since they don't disappear when the monarch is defeated. And the fact that each monarch doesn't seem to be truly evil also catches their eye, as instead they all appear to be well-intentioned people who go about their lives in broken ways. During this time, the player learns that Zenkichi is using the Phantom Thieves to further the case and has specific instructions to arrest them once they are no longer useful. Being unable to turn up any new information, the gang, along with their new cop companion, begin to depart for Okinawa, where a hidden Medice research facility is said to be located. Before departing though, they make a pit stop at Zenkichi's house and are introduced to his daughter, Akane. The player learns that Akane's mother was killed in a hit-and-run accident and now resents her father for being unable to bring the criminal to justice. She knows it was a legislator named Owada, but no one seems to listen to her because she is a child and that the politician is so powerful. In one of the funniest reveals of the game, Akane is shown to be a massive fan of the Phantom Thieves. The game has a bunch of these humorous moments that only stick if you love the characters, which I do, so they were absolutely fantastic. The evening concludes with the Phantom Thieves, specifically Best Girl Makoto, trying to comfort Akane and help her push past her trauma to forgive her father. The powerful message provided to the young girl sparks something inside her, which results in her acknowledging her father's safety for the first time in a long time. It's this act that begins to turn Zenkichi's perspective towards the Phantom Thieves from bad to good. Arriving in Okinawa, the gang discovers an abandoned research facility and plans to stay overnight until the next day when the business reopens. Overnight, the villagers go rogue and attempt to attack the Phantom Thieves, clearly signaling that they've been brainwashed like many others across Japan. Once inside the Okinawa jail, Sophia hears a voice calling out to her, which lures the gang to the middle of the facility, where a warden awaits for a tough boss fight. There's no monarch here, but the gang is still able to walk away with new information, that Medice engineered Emma to allow for the creation of jails in which a single person could be selected as its monarch. And this means whoever is behind it all has handpicked the previous 3 monarchs to begin stealing the desires of the masses. The gang returns to the mainland and shit begins to go south in a hurry. Owada, the corrupt politician from earlier, approaches Zenkichi's boss with an offer she can't refuse. Capture the Phantom Thieves now in order to receive a huge promotion. She calls for Zenkichi to stand down as the police prepare for a full-on raid to arrest the teenagers at a luxurious hotel. Our new favorite cop refuses to back off and lets out a loud message encouraging the Phantom Thieves to escape while it's still possible. He's promptly arrested and beaten before eventually being freed by Makoto's sister, Sainijima. Meanwhile, Konoe, the CEO of Medice, chooses Zenkichi's daughter Akane to be a monarch as bait to reel in the Phantom Thieves. This shorter jail is one of the best in the game from a story perspective, as we get to see Zenkichi awaken to his persona, which was totally a shock for me, as P5 kind of taught me that only teenagers could do it, but I guess I was wrong. It's an awesome scene as Zenkichi vows to rescue his daughter, stop Owada, and to aid the Phantom Thieves in their endeavor. Akane is eventually saved by the thieves, and with everyone rescued, the gang sets their sights on Konoe, realizing that he and Owada are behind it all. Makoto's sister Sai is able to get the police off the trail of the Phantom Thieves for a while, which allows the gang to operate in daylight once again. It's yet another moment of convenience in a game full of conveniences, which isn't really much of a surprise, given that's true of Persona 5 as well. With their freedom regained, the Phantom Thieves infiltrate Konoe's jail and make their way to the CEO in order to change his heart, expose the people behind Emma and the jails, and clear their names. The group succeeds in this endeavor, and everything seems happy-go-lucky for a bit. Konoe confesses his crimes and exposes Owada as the true mastermind, and the gang prepares to return home to wrap up their summer vacation. But anyone who has played Persona 5 knows that it can't be the true ending of the game unless things have been dialed up to the extreme. Despite my massive bias in favor of the game, I must admit that the ending of Strikers is rather weak and full of nonsensical logic. As the gang makes their way back to Shibuya, they receive news that the Emma servers have come back online, and everyone in Japan is falling into a trance-like state. Sophia reports that a massive new jail is currently engulfing the entire nation. So the Phantom Thieves, alongside of Zenkichi, return to the Tokyo radio tower where Emma's servers are housed. They access the jail, and they are immediately reminded of mementos as they venture further into the core. To the surprise of no one, Ichinose, the inventor of Emma, is waiting here for us, and reveals she intends to stop the thieves from destroying her creation. It's a plot twist that I saw coming from the first moment I met the character. If the developers meant to telegraph her true intentions, then the voice actor that they chose for the role did a fantastic job. I knew Ichinose was going to be involved in the finale as an antagonist simply from the way she spoke. On top of Ichinose's betrayal, Emma has absorbed enough of the people's desires to ascend to godhood and plans to rule over all of humanity by eliminating pain and suffering by brainwashing them into a peaceful yet zombie-like trance. So yeah, it's another god for the Phantom Thieves to defeat, which is kinda hokey, but at least the group themselves draw attention to the absurdity of it. However, the dialogue really doesn't do a great job of selling this ending. Ichinose spouts on about how she's heartless, and Sophia and Emma were born out of her obsession with learning more about the human heart. She talks about it in a way that suggests she believes that she doesn't have an actual, physical, beating heart, which is just stupid. It makes for a weak base, which makes Sophia's grand speech about love, hearts, and connection fall flat, despite the effect it seems to have on Ichinose. She also doesn't get a persona or a shadow of her own, meaning that her boss fight feels rather lifeless when compared to some of the other encounters with the Shadow Monarchs. Regardless, with her heart changed, Ichinose aids the team in their fight against Emma, who has changed her name to Demiurge after ascending to godhood. Demiurge attempts to show the Phantom Thieves its logic, but once again, the greatest force driving the Phantom Thieves, their sense of humanity's freedom and justice to those who would rob people of it, propels them into battle. It's an epic showdown that culminates with a beautiful cutscene where every member of the group gets some hits in before Joker finishes the god off once and for all. From here, the game begins to wrap things up as the group returns home and Ren prepares to head back home. We get a series of drawn-out goodbyes, which gives a player like me some time to detach from this set of characters that I've really come to enjoy over the years. The plot lines wrap up with Senkichi arresting Iwata, Lavenza praising you, Sophia reuniting with Ichinose, and the gang going their separate ways after vowing to meet up again during winter break. So that's the plot summary done, and I once again must point out my massive bias towards the Persona 5 universe, as I make it clear that I love the story that was told here, despite the fact that it did have its fair share of issues. The writing is sometimes over the top and might feel like it's wasting the player's time in some sections. It's also riddled with plot contrivances and conveniences that are hard to overlook, such as how connected all the characters are, like Iwata being behind the whole scheme while also happening to be the one who killed Zenkichi's wife. And Iwata himself creates a huge point of anticlimax in the story, as it feels like things are building towards him being the final boss, or at least the final human boss, but you never fight him, which was disappointing. The ending of the game also feels very forced, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't have a big stupid grin on my face when the thieves proved their resolve and vanquished the newly formed god. Still, the whole sequence really isn't ideal. So yes, issues exist, but I don't care. These characters are endearing, and the game does a brilliant job of creating the illusion that you're one of the gang. Each of them has quirks and interesting personalities, but the bond they share, along with their steadfast sense of justice, is inspiring, meaning you get the best of both worlds. Going out in yukata for a night on the town is just as rewarding as it is to defeat a powerful monarch, and that's due to how these characters accommodate these moments so well, despite the massive difference in tone and atmosphere associated with each. And it really is that camaraderie between the thieves that makes them most appealing, as on their own, they really aren't anything too special, but when they're amongst each other, it feels like one of those grand moments where the universe has pulled together an amazing group of people despite their differences. Ultimately, the reason I love the story of Persona 5 Strikers is because I've come to view these characters as real people, and once your guard is down to something like that, it's hard to ever recover from. All I wanted was more time with these characters because they felt like another set of friends to learn and grow from, just like their real-life counterparts in my own life. And for this reason, I'm grateful to have journeyed with them again throughout this story. Persona 5 Strikers ditches much of the life sim gameplay elements found in the original Persona 5, and also elects to change its combat up drastically by going full-on Dynasty Warriors. As a result of this, the game spans only 35 hours instead of a staggering 110, but it fits pretty well given this game spans the course of a summer vacation instead of a full calendar school year. I won't lie, I did miss the life sim elements and the confidants, but enough was done to make up for it with the lively adventures the gang gets into across the story. So with that being said, much of Strikers' gameplay comes down to combat, so let's take a deep dive into that. Gone are the days of my preferred combat style, turn-based, as something new has taken its place. The Dynasty Warriors approach isn't what I wanted necessarily, but it does go a long way in making sure this game feels like its own standalone title instead of being DLC for Persona 5. The change to combat is so drastic that the player never gets lulled into that problematic feeling that what they're playing shouldn't be its own standalone title. So even though I'm not big on the change personally, I can still appreciate how important it was in making this game feel distinct from the base game. If you're not familiar with Dynasty Warriors, I have bad news for you. I wasn't either before playing this game, so forgive me if my assessment is rather rudimentary compared to a genre expert. The combat here is much more action-packed with free movement, tons of attacks both physical and magical, combos to build style meters, and of course, a massive barrage of enemies swarming you from all angles. And the copious number of enemies is what truly defines this subgenre, as you'll constantly find yourself in encounters involving dozens and dozens of enemies, with only a few instances of boss encounters breaking the mold and providing a single opponent. It's a brilliant approach for a medium that's all about empowering the player and making them feel stronger than they could in real life. You almost certainly couldn't win a fight against 20 other people in real life, but here, a much larger crowd than that can be a breeze to take down. And that sense of power is what allowed me to enjoy this combat system a lot more than I thought I would going in. However, it does still create some issues. I always notice that in games that are designed to make the player feel all-powerful, sudden difficulty spikes provide a massive sense of frustration, more so than in games that are designed to challenge you from the start. For example, I got very frustrated during a few portions of this game where I came up against a powerful enemy and kept getting my ass kicked, and it was due to the game's design building up my sense of strength and power. Because I had been conditioned to think I was all-powerful and could deal with so many enemies, coming up against one single foe who kept beating me down felt very frustrating and counterintuitive to that design principle. It's an issue that only affected maybe 4 or 5 encounters throughout the game, so I guess I can't complain too much, but it did pop up a few times. Instead, I mostly enjoyed the sense of control that I had over most combat encounters, fully confident in my ability to mow down large groups of foes. And that's mostly due to how many options were available to use. The development team found a way to carry over all the most important elements of Persona 5's combat into this game, while still providing it with a big twist structurally. In any standard combat encounter, you'll have 4 active party members and 4 or 5 waiting in reserve. You can play as any character within your active party at any time, unless they have a status ailment that prevents switching to them. Each Phantom Thief has a basic melee attack and a skill tied to the triangle button. The player can combine these attacks to create combos that build up a style meter, and when that's full, the player can perform a showtime attack, which is a massively choreographed barrage on a large group of enemies. They're extremely useful for mopping up foes, but also do a great job of tying into that grandiose, over-the-top sense of style that Persona 5 was known for. And then of course there's the personas. Each Phantom Thief has their own persona that usually contains a distinct elemental skill. For example, Nuclear in the case of Makoto, and Bless for Sophia, alongside of other physical and support skills. Ren plays the role of the Joker, meaning he can house multiple personas within himself at once, meaning the player can juggle through different personas to always find an elemental advantage over your enemies. There's plenty of generic shadow enemies in the game that can be defeated in a multitude of ways, but there's also a large number of persona-based enemies who can be killed more easily by exploiting their weaknesses using a specific elemental affinity. If the player is able to hit this weakness enough times, an enemy's defense will break, opening them up to an all-out attack, which not only deals massive damage, but also sucks in nearby enemies to deal out more pain. The trade-off is that using persona abilities costs SP, which is a limited resource that can only be regained by exiting and re-entering the dungeon, or using items to replenish it. it creates a level of strategy, as the player will always have to manage stamina consumption throughout their party while also making sure they're outputting enough damage to win each fight. At least that would be the case if not for the fact that you can leave the dungeons at nearly any time to get a free replenishing of your health and stamina. The only penalty to doing this is losing roughly 2 minutes of time in which you could be progressing. It borderline feels like it's designed just to waste the player's time. Like, sure, you can have all your health and stamina back and return to this checkpoint instantly, but it's going to cost you 2 minutes of your time. Allowing the player to heal at checkpoints might have been a better solution, although it could have just cut down on how many times the player returns to the real world to engage with item buying. Regardless, most combat encounters in the game will see the player juggling their physical abilities, combos, persona abilities, and showtime attacks in order to seize the day. It has the ability to challenge the player's decision-making skills while also ensuring that they feel a real sense of power by destroying hordes of enemies rather quickly and efficiently. Combat can feel so good in this game when everything is firing on all cylinders, and you're avoiding all the damage while outputting a ton of it onto your opponents. I really enjoyed it most of the time, despite it having to win me over from the turn-based system that I was privy to. There were some points though where the game's combat system didn't click with me fully, and it came mostly during boss encounters against single opponents. This mostly was due to what felt like sudden leaps in the game's difficulty, and as I mentioned earlier, it created a sense of dissonance within me. This applied both to boss monsters found throughout the dungeons, as well as a few of the final bosses like the Snowy Monarch Hayoto and the final boss in the Demiurge. Some of these encounters kicked my ass over and over again and immediately robbed me of the sense of power that the game had built up in my capabilities. It felt like my options were to either spend time grinding out levels or bump down the difficulty to easy. During the middle section of the game, I opted to grind out some levels by spending 3 hours roaming around the map, wiping out the same groups of enemies, while listening to some podcasts. This allowed me to get back up to speed. But I must admit, and I'm not proud of it, but I ended up putting the difficulty to easy during the final boss fight because I was sick of losing. This was the game's climax, and I wanted to see how things would conclude. And I just couldn't bring myself to spend a few extra hours grinding in order to defeat this foe. It left me with a bad taste in my mouth and soured the game's final combat encounter to a degree. I will admit though that part of this difficulty spike can be attributed to me as a player. I'll talk more about the side content in a little bit, but suffice it to say, it couldn't hold my interest and stopped me from attaining the additional levels that would have come along with completing those tasks. On top of that, the game doesn't do a great job of explaining and tutorializing the persona upgrade system, which may have resulted in me having underpowered personas for much of the game. I never felt like I had mastered or even come close to understanding how creating new personas and upgrading them worked, and that failure to teach is certainly a shortcoming of the game. I mentioned earlier that Strikers assumes that you've played Persona 5, which is fine, but the problem here is that I don't feel that that game did a good job of explaining persona creation either, so I didn't have a big enough knowledge basis for anything of value to carry over here without further guidance. And these issues resulted in a small handful of encounters across the game that felt unnecessarily difficult, and so that did take away from my overall enjoyment a little bit, even though I enjoyed most of the other clashes. The game's decision to rebrand a lot of its terms relating to the metaverse may seem like an odd step, but it might have been necessary given the drastic change to combat. What I mean is that fights in Strikers are conducted in large open spaces, and the level design of the palaces wouldn't have been able to accommodate such massive encounters. Because of this, coming up with the concept of jails might have been a necessary step in order to house many of these fights. You certainly couldn't fight 100 enemies in an art exhibit, but they fit a lot better contextually and literally in the city streets. This change results in the player stumbling into a lot more open spaces than they would have in Persona 5, and it does make for a nice change of pace overall. My only issue with the level design is that it does tend to get awfully repetitive, especially in the first half of the game, as all 3 jails are structured the same in terms of how the player progresses. Stylistically, they are different, but structurally, they are not. The Phantom Thieves will enter the jail, they'll find the boss's lair, they'll track down 3 cores housed in massive towers which unlock access to the boss's lair. From there, they bear witness to the Monarch's trauma and take on a warden before having one final confrontation with the Monarch to end things. You'll do this for 4 out of the 7 jails, which is already over half. And on top of that, these 4 jails are the largest ones in the game. And so it's very easy to feel like you're going through the motions over and over again, since this game rarely incorporates puzzles that compare favorably to the mediocre ones that were already offered in Persona 5. So overall, I think the level design suits this game rather nicely, but I didn't enjoy it as much as I did with the palaces in Persona 5. There are, of course, RPG elements to be found within Persona 5 Strikers, but I didn't find the offerings to be very robust. There's 3 main elements of choice to this RPG: team building, persona creation, and the bond system. Team building is the simplest one, so let's start there. At the very start of the game, you'll have 7 different playable characters to choose from, and we'll gain 2 more over the course of the story. It's important to keep these characters leveled up, and switching them in and out of your active party helps in ensuring equal experience distribution. It's certainly possible though to choose a core group and stick with them for most of the game. For example, my core group ended up being Ren, Makoto, Haru, and Zenkichi by the time the credits rolled. With that being said though, you can always swap in a new character between battles if you feel one of their elemental attacks might give you the edge you need. And each of the characters needs to be equipped with a weapon and armor, which all get better, but also more expensive as the game moves forward. It's pretty simple stuff, but there's certainly a level of flexibility to team building that I did appreciate. I've already talked a little bit about the persona creation system and how I don't believe it's properly explained to the player. Joker is able to house multiple personas as well as fuse them together, meaning there's a lot of possibilities on offer. However, personas tended to level up very slowly during my playthrough, and so trips to the Velvet Room were often necessary in order to fuse stronger personas. You can earn a special type of XP that can be used to level up personas in the Velvet Room. However, I never felt like I had enough of this currency to consistently level up more than one specific persona, which put a lot of pressure on the fusion system to deliver. And to be honest, I felt like I stumbled throughout this aspect of the game, which resulted in it feeling like one of the weaker RPG elements. And then there's the bond system, which is essentially a skill tree that allows the player to gain specific buffs like more health, more stamina, better item discovery, more health recovery, better lockpicking skills, and more. Completing tough battles and sharing fun moments together as a team rewards the player with bond points that can be put into these skills. The skills are also incremented so you can level them up more than once. My only complaint here is that some of the skill upgrades are tied to completing specific requests, which were very rarely interesting or engaging. And this meant that some options were locked away behind the game's most boring content, which just doesn't feel good. Still, overall, the bond system is easy to digest and is a nice complement to the combat. Again, much of the RPG elements are kept pretty light, and they are mostly meant to be a nice supplement to aid the combat, and in that regard, they work out just fine. I really enjoyed the combat of Persona 5 Strikers, but only as a supplement to the story being told. I've never been enthralled by the Dynasty Warriors approach, but it did enough to keep me playing if it meant getting to reach the next bit of the story. However, when it comes to the side content that comes in the form of requests, I couldn't bring myself to re-enter the dungeons to complete a checklist of chores. Throughout the game, the player can tackle a plentiful number of requests that involve venturing into previous jails and completing tasks like killing a certain number of enemies, creating a persona with a specific move, or even just finding ingredients or items in the overworld. The player is rewarded with items and more bond points that can be used for upgrades. These extrinsic rewards are alright, but for me personally, I didn't have much of an intrinsic reason for completing these requests. Outside of facing previous bosses to get another big EXP boost, and completing a handful of them for my fellow team members, I couldn't bring myself to complete or even engage with the vast majority of these requests. They felt so lifeless to me, but that's mostly due to my interest in the story over the gameplay. If you like the Dynasty Warrior setup, you'll probably enjoy these much more than I did. I've saved the discussion of the game's presentation for last, but make no mistake, it remains just as strong as it was in Persona 5. That now iconic art style and music has been carefully retained while also applying a new layer of paint that really makes things pop here. So let's break down the presentation. Alright, it's the music section of a Persona 5 related review. Could it be any more obvious how much I'm about to praise this game's music? In fact, this might be the first review or critique that I've ever done where I talk about music before graphics and art style because the tunes are just so good. And that's not a knock on the art style either, as it remains strong too. If you loved the music from the original, then you're gonna love Striker's OST. Much of the music is faster than the previous hits to better jive with the fast-paced action of gameplay. The sped-up version of Last Surprise was an instant classic the second I heard it, and other returning hits like Life Will Change and Rivers in the Desert feel equally as home. And as a quick side note, I didn't realize how nostalgic I had become for the background songs and sound effects that accompany story bits. I constantly found myself smiling like an idiot while hearing some of these returning favorites. But just because the old songs remain good doesn't mean that the new songs aren't also amazing, because of course they are. One of my new favorite additions was Axe to Grind, which seemed to jive wonderfully into the combat and the action of it. There's something so awesome about syncing up an all-out attack or a Showtime attack with the hype moments in the song. It's a moment of pure joy, and you'll pull it off dozens of times throughout the game, and each time you do, it feels just as good as the last time. Other new songs assert their spot in the OST as well, such as What You Wish For and You Are Stronger. There really isn't much else for me to say. Persona 5 and the songs found within it are literally the only video game songs that I ever listened to outside of the game. They have transcended the portion of my brain dedicated to video games and have carved a niche in my everyday playlist. If you never play any of these games, do yourself a favor and check out the music from these titles. They make for excellent workout songs, and they're always bangers. The thing that impresses me most about the graphics, art style, and animation of Persona 5 Strikers is not just that the standard set by P5 has been maintained, but that it's also been surpassed in some regards. Persona 5's art style has become rather iconic in the 4 years since its release, and remains one of the most praised elements of that game. From combat animations, to the way you move, to HUD elements, and to the menu system, everything was presented in a way that emphasizes an over-the-top style. It oozes confidence, charm, and a sharpness that just isn't found in most other games. And that trend continues in Persona 5 Strikers, as much of what was already great remains great here. From the city streets you meander down, to the character design, to sharp interior environments, to the crisp and free-flowing menu screen, and much, much more, style is key. In particular, everything related to the thieves is dramatically emphasized, from poses, to animations, to designs, to colors, and more, while everything else not relating to the gang is a little bit more subdued without breaking from the overall art style. And this visual emphasis helps cement the coolness of the Phantom Thieves without sacrificing everything else to total monotony. The area of greatest improvement comes in the facial animations of the characters, as their ability to emote and create recognizable emotions is more well realized than before. Often in Persona 5, my eyes were glued to the text bubbles, and that just wasn't the case in Strikers, as the more fluid animations made me spend more time looking at the actual characters. It was a subtle tweak that allowed me to feel more immersed into the events taking place. The only graphical elements that were a bit lacking for me was the designs of some of the jails. They each had their own theme, but outside of maybe the Okinawa jail, many of them failed to surpass the genericism associated with their concept. For example, the snow jail looked like an ice-based world that you could pull out of almost any game, instead of being the more pronounced and stylistic take you'd expect from a Persona 5 related game. They often felt too close to being mundane and could never recapture the magic found in the palace themes of the base game. But besides this under-inspired design to some of the jails, I really enjoyed the visual treats on offer as I played through Persona 5 Strikers. In terms of presentational hiccups, the only misstep I can cite is the camera, which really struggles to keep up with things at times. When locking onto an enemy, it's not uncommon to accidentally change targets, which can be disorientating. This is especially true for some bosses who have the ability to teleport around the arena. There's also times where you'll dodge an attack and go to strike back, but you'll be aiming in a completely different direction than you were before, and you end up wasting stamina or bullets on areas where there's no enemies, which is super frustrating. This, though, was really my only complaint about the presentation, as it remained relatively strong throughout. This review ended up being slightly more critical of Persona 5 Strikers than I had anticipated. With that being said, a lot of my attitude towards this game remains vastly favorable despite the issues. All of the issues I mentioned ended up not being much more than simple nuisances, as I joyfully cruise throughout the game with a set of characters that I've really grown fond of. The story is full of heart, fun, justice, and perseverance, but it's much more bite-sized and digestible when compared to the monolith of Persona 5. The combat is fast, dynamic, and contains more strategy than you might think going in, and it's accompanied by a wonderful art style and score that elevates every element of the gameplay and narrative. Truly, the arrival of Persona 5 Strikers felt like the stars aligning and the universe throwing a bone to me. One of my top 5 favorite games of all time got a meaty sequel chock full of all the elements that endeared me to the original game. How could I be upset about a few small issues? The answer is I can't. It might be biased of me to say this, but I knew I'd love Persona 5 Strikers before I even bought the game. And as I sit here writing the final sentence of this review, all I can say is that my prediction came true. Hey there guys, hope you enjoyed this review of Persona 5 Strikers. If you did, be sure to check out some of my other lengthy reviews on the channel, including looks at recent games like Hitman 3 and Cyberpunk 2077. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Consider subscribing for more. Follow me on Twitter at NopNapNarp. And as always, have a nice day and take care.